In this lesson, we're going to be talking about some of the common React hooks mistakes. Let's get started by copying our use network lesson 6 code into our current working directory. Let's get started by taking a look at usepicture.js. You'll see our use network hook that we made, and it takes a URL in this object. Let's also add the method here. By default, fetch will use a get request, which is what we need for this URL, but for the purposes of this example, let's just add it explicitly. Now let's come into our useNetwork.js. Let's add the method here, and then let's also add it here. And then lastly, let's actually add it to the fetch call. So you'll notice everything's the same. It works exactly as we would expect. But I'm going to show you how we can make this horribly wrong and mess up terribly. Imagine instead of pulling out these strings from our object, we actually just reference the whole request object. We'll call it request options. And now down here, let's put request options as our dependency for this useEffect. And now inside of here, I need to go through and put request options.url, and then the method would be request options.method. And let's see if I missed anything else. Well, I may have missed something else, but you'll see that my browser is freaking out. And I really need to stop this and undo this. Let's just put a return here so I can reload it and it will stop doing this. You may have noticed it made like 100 requests and it's still going. I gotta figure out some way to stop this. I want to keep this code so you guys can see what happened, but let's go into our use picture and let's not return anything here. Okay, so there's been 900 requests to the NASA API. I'm pretty sure that they hate me and I'm never going to be able to make a network request to NASA again. The browser's so freaked out that I really can't get anything to work. Okay, I think I may have gotten it back to normal. Okay, so what just happened right there is something that happens to a lot of new people with React hooks. And that problem is messing up your use effect and doing a non-stop re-render. So how did we do this? Let's uncomment this, but be sure to not hit save. Our use network is taking an object in. Because we're writing this object right here, every time this component is re-rendered, that object is creating a brand new object because it's just inlined. When we reference that object, which is we call it request options in our use network, and we add that down here to our request options in our use effect, it's saying, okay, if request options changes, run this effect. When it runs this effect, our state changes, which causes this to load again, and this object is created again. So one solution is what I had before. The solution is if you only have a few parameters and you know there's something that are just strings and they're not objects, in this case, URL and method, we can safely pass URL and method directly to the use effect. Because those are strings, every render, get is still get. So the string get always equals get. So one way to visualize this is let's just do this. If I type get and I say does that equal get, it's true. But now let's take this object, and say does that object equal me pasting that object again? Well, first off, we're getting date is undefined. Let's just fix that real quick. Let's just say let date equal blah. Paste it here, equals again, and it's false. So why is that? It's just the way that JavaScript works. By putting a curly brace and putting some stuff inside that object, if I do that exact same thing again, that's a new object created in memory by the JavaScript engine. It's important to understand this, especially being new to React or JavaScript in general, because it is something you need to think about when you're writing hooks. There's a couple ways to solve this problem. First is to go back to how I had it before, which I'll actually do that for now, because you may be thinking, well, why don't I just do how you had it before? You'll see why, because it may not always work depending on how complicated your hook gets. But let's go ahead and undo this and go back to URL and method. Okay, I have URL and method there. Let's go back here. Yeah, okay, well now I can't actually hit the NASA API because there's too many requests. But for the point of this video, you'll still be able to see what I'm talking about. You'll see that we only hit that one time. We hit that API once, and I'm going to filter by it just to make it easier to see. Okay, one time. Now, what if we came in here and we wanted our network request API to support headers? Headers come in an object, so we're going to have the same issue again. Let's just make this header called test, and it's true that we're sending to the server. If I hit save, nothing's going to happen yet because we're not using headers. But let's go into our use network. Let's add the headers. And then now let's depend on headers, which again is an object. And let's actually pass these along. If I hit save, you're going to see a million requests. I'm going to hit save and quickly undo it. Okay, so it's made 600 requests again to NASA. Again, they're going to hate me. Let's go back to how that was. You may be surprised just how easy it is to get into these infinite loop scenarios, but if you just remember every time you're creating an object and you're not referencing a string or a number or a float, anything like that, it will cause re-renders. And there's a way to solve this. So how can we do that? Let's go back to our use picture. Right here, all of these options, we can pull these out, and let's call it options equals use memo. And what this will do is we pass in something that we want to memoize, and we give it a dependency array just like useEffect. So what I'm saying here is I want this options object right here to only change when whatever is in here changes. In the case of this, there's nothing to change it, so it should just always return one object and never keep creating new instances. So let's pass that into here. And now let's save this and use the headers again. And we'll hit save, and you'll see that it did work as expected. So to summarize, if you have something in your useEffect and it's an object, and you know the end user is going to pass in that object in the render, like we had here, you need to make sure that you call useMemo. All useMemo does is say, I only want a new version of this, a new reference, if whatever is in here changes. So it's a really simple concept, but it can really bite you if you forget about it or don't understand how objects get created in JavaScript. So let's go over another common mistake. I'm going to be continuing off of last lesson, but I'm going to undo just a little bit. Let's get back to where we were not using useMemo. So right here. A common thing you'll see people do is they'll have something like this, and in their use network, they won't add headers to the dependency array. So let's hit save, and then let's come over here and hit save. And let's also return data and loading again. All right, it's erroring because the API request doesn't work. But for the point of this, you'll see if I look at the network tab, it does only make one request to the NASA API. If I were to go in here and correctly put headers right here, it's going to do an infinite loop again. So you'll see if someone's like, well, I'm not actually changing the headers, so I don't mind if it's not in here. The problem with this is that your hook isn't built correctly. If someone does come in here and maybe this header is based on state, let's say test set test equals use state, and let's put test right here. So our test is now based on state, and you'll just have to imagine that for some reason later on someone calls set test and it changes. Well, that changed, but because we don't have headers as a dependency to our useEffect, it doesn't work. So you might be thinking, well, that's weird. Why would someone do that? But the funny thing is you see this happen all the time, and people are always trying to make up an excuse for why they did it. When in reality, all they should have done is put headers right here and required headers to be used memoed. What would be better though is to just make this whole options object be useMemoed. So if we just do what we had before, useMemo, and we return this object, and we say this will change whenever test changes. And also, I think a mistake I made, the last one was date, because I didn't notice it over here. But if test and date changes, that's when we want our options to change. And if those things don't change, we don't want our network request to change. So it's kind of like a step out of your hook. Above your hook, you need to make sure you useMemo your options object if you have a bunch of options to your hook, and those things contain objects. But another solution to this, instead of having to think about useMemos and all of these things, it's much better to make your hook API as simple and flat as you can. So in our case before, we just had method and URL, which are strings. We don't have to ever think about useMemo because nothing getting passed to our hook that a useEffect depends on is an object. Everything's just strings. Hopefully that makes sense. I know this is a little bit complicated, but I hope that you come back and reference this after you start writing more hooks. The other big reference is you need to check out the React Hooks docs. The React Hooks documentation covers everything you could possibly need to know. It comes complete with an FAQ that covers all kinds of stuff. I recommend you read it once, maybe even twice, to really understand everything. It's possible if you run into an issue like my infinite render example, you could probably find all of this covered here. They've really gone through and put a lot of work in to make sure you understand why they made the decisions they did and how you should be architecting your components. In this lesson, we're going to explain what useCallback is for. So let's make a new file and call it useComplete. This is just going to be an example hook, and we're going to act like something happens and then it calls back to some function when it's complete. So let's call it export const useComplete. And then inside of here, let's just imagine that there's a useEffect. And inside of here, just imagine there was a network request, but we won't actually do one. After that network request is complete, we want to call back to whatever the user passed in. We'll call it completed request, and then down here we will call completed request. So because we added that here to our useEffect, we need to add that as a dependency. Let's add some dummy piece of data here, like test data came back, and now let's actually use this in our app.js. So let's write useComplete, and inside of here we have a callback, so it gets the data, and then we will console log it. And now what do you think is going to happen when I hit save? If I come into the console, it says test data. So it appears to work, right? What if we add some state into our app? Let's call it clicked and set clicked. And we will put useState. And now whenever we click on this, we will set click to true, or we'll just set click to the opposite of whatever it is. I need to call this correctly. I need to call set clicked with not clicked. Okay, so let's save that, and now we see test data. What do you think is going to happen when I click hello? We see test data get logged again. We wouldn't want that to happen, right? We're changing some state with something completely unrelated, and it's rerunning our effect from useComplete. So if we actually had something here, maybe it was really long time to compute, like a network request, we wouldn't want that running every time unless whatever was passed here changed. So this is where useCallback comes in. It's very similar to the issue we had in our last lessons. We need to put a useCallback around this. The only difference between useCallback and useMemo is that useMemo returns whatever is inside of it, but useCallback will return a function. So we'll see how that looks here. We'll call it complete callback, and we'll say that equals useCallback. And right here we have the function right here. We will just copy and paste this actually, and put it here. And we will say that never needs to change. There's nothing that it depends on. So now let's add that here. And we hit save, and we see it says test data. And now let's change the state. I'm clicking and changing the state. And just to confirm that I am, I'll render clicked here so you can see it change. All right, let's actually put if clicked, clicked, otherwise not clicked. Okay, so not clicked, clicked. So the state is changing, and just like we expect now, our useComplete is not getting re-rendered. Now again, this might really be messing with your brain, like, oh my gosh, hooks just got even more complicated, right? So this is something that myself, I rarely use. It depends on how you architect your hooks. If your hooks are taking in a callback as an option, yes, it's going to be annoying to have to use a callback all the time. But if you want to get some data back, it would be much better if you just use the use state and you had data loading right here, returned from your hook, instead of some sort of callback. So just like our network request example, it returned data and loading, we never had to think about callbacks. I just bring this up because it is something you might see out there. And I want you to think really hard when you do see someone use callback and think, could that API have been done better so that I don't need use callback? And the same thing goes for use memo. There's valid reasons to use both, but maybe you can make your hook better to where you don't need to think about those things. And I try very hard to barely need use memo, to barely use callback, just because it makes it so much easier for all the other developers on the team and myself included. There's just less to think about. This is going to be a really short episode to get you to think about useEffect and all of the other hooks a little bit better. You may have heard me say when I do this, oh, this hook is just going to run on mount. That's not really something that you should say. It's kind of my leftover thought process when there was class components in React. What this really is saying is, oh, this effect is only going to run once because there's nothing in here that can change. Whereas if I had something like a date that I took in, and I add the date here, oh, this useEffect is going to run anytime the date changes. So when it's first set up and the date is first passed in, it's going to run. And if the date ever changes, this function is going to run again. I just wanted to make that a really quick lesson to clear up, because sometimes I do just say on mount and you might be getting confused when I say that. So I hope that helps.